Now, body armor is one of those weird things the government has been trying to get rid of for civilian use for years now, which has actually succeeded in some states like New York, for example, which currently only certain personnel, like those in law enforcement, military security, and a few other approved fields, can legally purchase it. But for the average citizen who's just looking for a bit of extra protection, it's pretty much off limits. Now, thankfully, California hasn't gotten any funny ideas, at least not lately, and I don't want to jinx it because, as you can see, I'm wearing my plate carrier, which I usually run level 4 plates, of course. Now, the real question is, why would the government want to get rid of something that is literally created to keep bullets from entering your vital organs? Well, there's a couple of reasons which we'll be talking about in today's video. So, starting off with the first, they don't believe you need it. After all, you're just a regular civilian. You're not a soldier, you're not law enforcement. They argue that it's unnecessary for someone who isn't facing some sort of danger or actively in a war zone to own something intended for the protection in extreme combat situations. Now, I would argue as a civilian that the use for body armor isn't always about being in some military or law enforcement combat situation. Same way I would argue that firearms aren't only used by the military or law enforcement for combat or operations. Civilians have had the right to own firearms for the protection of oneself, one's family, and one's property in some states, all thanks to our Constitution and the rights recognized under the Second Amendment, ensuring that free citizens have access to the tools needed to defend themselves against foreign or domestic threats, whether those threats are criminals or government. And just as the Second Amendment protects the right to own firearms, it also protects the right to own and possess things such as body armor. Now, people get confused thinking that the Second Amendment is only about firearms, but if you look closely, the word arms, as defined in the 1773 Samuel Johnson's dictionary, is defined as weapons of offense or armor of defense. This means that the term arms isn't just limited to firearms. It includes any tools used for defense as well. Okay, so now that we know that body armor is clearly covered under the Second Amendment, that still hasn't stopped the government from telling you and I that we have no use for it as civilians. But the reality is far from that. Civilians all over the US have found plenty of use for body armor over the years now. For example, many people keep body armor in their homes just in case of an emergency, like someone breaking into their house. Now, I'll admit, most of us probably won't have time to throw it on in the heat of the moment, but at least our families will. Now, another place people often keep body armor is inside their vehicle. I've seen some people put it in their trunk, but personally, I keep mine behind my seat. I look at it this way: if I'm out on the road and something crazy pops off, I want to be able to have access to it without having to exit my vehicle. That way I can quickly grab it, slap it on, and make my way home. Now look, we live in a disgusting world where there are unstable pieces of shit who go into schools with the intent to harm as many children as possible. Now, I've seen the idea of packing body armor in backpacks, and I got no problem with that, especially if it saves lives. Now, of course, if it were up to me, these people wouldn't be able to step a foot on campus without a couple of holes through them. But sadly, we live in a world where we protect everyone we claim is important with guns, yet expect a gun-free zone sign to protect the lives of children. Now, one last way I've seen civilians use body armor is, of course, for training. Whether it's for sports like running or hiking with it, or taking a more tactical approach of training with firearms, I've seen body armor be this valuable tool that helps many build endurance and help strength among those who train with it and get familiar with their gear, especially with something like body armor, which, if you're not accustomed to the extra weight and feel, can be a challenge at first when you're training with it. Now, some might acknowledge that all this sounds reasonable and say, hey, we understand that people have a right to own body armor, whether it's for personal protection at home, at school, in their car, or simply for training purposes. However, they would still argue that body armor should not be widely available to civilians, claiming safety as their main reason. They argue that because there are no requirements to purchase body armor, anyone, including violent criminals, can easily obtain it, using it to resist law enforcement and pose a greater threat to the public. Which I agree. Having a criminal walking around with body armor makes law enforcement's job much harder, and most importantly, makes it harder for us to defend ourselves against criminals wearing it. So the important question is, what do we do about it? Do we completely ban body armor for civilian use? Do we run background checks and have people fill out a 4473? What do we do to prevent criminals from obtaining body armor? Now, before I answer that question, I think it's important to bring up some stats relating to body armor, because far from what the media says and how they make it seem like we're having a widespread problem of criminals committing crimes with body armor, the reality is quite different. According to the Violence Project, a nonpartisan research center that studies gun violence in America, they found that at least 21 times in the last 40 years, a mass shooter has worn body armor during their attacks. This means, statistically speaking, it is extremely rare for criminals to commit crimes while wearing body armor. But don't get me wrong, the very few times criminals have used body armor has led to some of the most horrendous acts imaginable, making these incidents stand out. Some of the most well-known examples include the North Hollywood shootout, where two armed robbers engaged in a shootout with LAPD officers. Despite law enforcement, including SWAT, landing multiple shots on the robbers, the body armor effectively protected them, preventing most of the shots from hitting vital areas. Next, you have the Aura Theater shooting, where the shooter wore a ballistic vest, helmet, and other protective gear. Now, he didn't get into a shootout with law enforcement. He was arrested without further resistance shortly after exiting the theater. Finally, there's the Buffalo shooting, which ultimately sparked a discussion about banning body armor. In this case, the shooter entered a market primarily targeting black victims in a racially motivated attack. But before entering the store, Aaron Salter, a retired Buffalo police officer working as security, confronted the shooter. Salter opened fire, but the shooter's bulletproof vest stopped the rounds. The shooter then returned fire, unfortunately killing Salter before continuing the attack inside the market. Now, while I agree that some of these events are among the worst when criminals wore body armor, it's important to know a couple of key points. For example, the North Hollywood shooters were wearing homemade body armor, which was not commercially available and was actually crafted by the criminals themselves. Also, the Uvalde shooter is often brought up in the conversation when talking about criminals wearing body armor, but it is worth clarifying that he didn't actually wear any sort of body armor. He just wore a tactical vest, but it had no ballistic protection inside. As well as many other criminals involved in high-profile incidents have worn tactical vests and other military-style apparel, yet none of these items provided any sort of level of protection. Now, I say this to make sure people understand that not every incident involving criminals in tactical gear is the same. People often like to group these to inflate the statistics of criminals wearing body armor. So now that we cleared that up, let's get back to the original question. How do we prevent criminals from obtaining body armor without infringing on everyone else's rights? While one possible solution people recommend is implementing background checks for purchasing body armor, we have to remember that body armor is not a firearm, it's a personal protective equipment. It doesn't pose a direct threat to others and is primarily used for defense, so that idea is off the table. Now, others propose creating laws to make it illegal for criminals to buy body armor and use it for committing crimes. But wait, that's already the case in most states. Many states already have laws prohibiting convicted criminals from acquiring body armor, purchasing it with criminal intent. Now, I view body armor in the same way I view firearms when it comes to criminals getting access to things they're already prohibited from having. Whether it's homemade body armor or firearms purchased off the black market, criminals will always find a way to get it, no matter what laws we put in place. That's why I suggest making it easier for law-abiding citizens to legally be armed, whether that's through a faster CCW permit process or adopting a constitutional carry nationwide. We must ensure that everyday citizens have the ability to protect themselves against criminals who intend to do them harm. Next, we need to eliminate gun-free zones. Many of the high-profile attacks where criminals wore body armor occurred in places where strict laws on carrying firearms created an environment where they knew they could act unopposed. It's important to remember that even with body armor, these criminals are not invincible. Most of their vital areas like head, arms, and legs remain exposed. There is a far greater chance of someone being able to defend themselves if they have access to a firearm rather than being completely disarmed. Finally, we need to implement stronger punishment for criminals, similar to what Trump proposed for those involved in selling illegal substances. We need harsher sentences for criminals who commit crimes using body armor. Look, we are at a point in America where criminals aren't afraid to commit crimes because they know the most they'll get is a slap on the wrist. I'm just gonna say it, America has gone soft, and this has had a huge impact on us, the citizens, who are left to deal with the consequences of criminals constantly being released back on the streets, even though it is clear that they should have never been let out in the first place. And when I say harsher sentences, I am not talking about longer prison sentences that taxpayers will have to fund to keep these people alive. If caught using body armor as an active shooter or in a situation where you're putting people's lives in danger, I believe you surrender the right to live. And if caught alive, you should be sentenced to death. I know some people may not agree with that, but we've reached a point where criminals no longer fear the consequences of their actions. This needs to change. This is about putting the fear back into criminals, sending the message that if you think you're going to go around hurting innocent people, be prepared to start counting your days. Now, while I understand that these solutions don't inherently stop criminals from accessing things like body armor, they're more designed to benefit law-abiding citizens, giving them at least the ability to defend themselves and making criminals think twice before committing crimes. Because at the end of the day, it is not fair that free citizens are always the ones dealing with the consequences of criminals' actions. This needs to stop. The blame lies solely on the person who committed the crime. That individual should face the full consequences of their actions without infringing on the rest of the rights of free citizens. So that's all I gotta say. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe. Also, if you're interested in seeing some of the training drills I've done in the past while using my plate carrier, make sure to check out my Instagram at ShadowTheWicked. Also, if you want to get in contact with me, that's a great place. But other than that, hope you guys have a good weekend. Stay safe and God bless.